So not going to get right to that one, that gospel, but I will. I'm going to start with this little gesture, which only recently did I realize that I actually do that more than I knew I did that I'll see someone of, like one of you across the parking lot at Shaw's and sort of reach out, hey, and kind of do the little salute thing. And maybe it was Veterans Day, or actually maybe it was me watching now for the second time, and I'll probably see it 3 or 4 more times, The Band of Brothers, which I think was a 20th anniversary for its first airing. That's happened, I think, given Veterans Day. At any rate, I watched it again, and I must say I have much respect, sincere from the depths of my heart, for all military. But I love this, and I wasn't in the military. And so I don't want to do this without thinking or in any disrespectful way. In fact, I've done some research. And if you're going to do this correctly, it has to be sharp, snappy, and the arm has to be horizontal, elbow could be out slightly, hands together as one, bottom of the hand looking down, and if you had a hat with a visor, you'd touch your visor, if otherwise kind of up in that area. And it's that, and officers are doing this like constantly. And when you're first beginning, you want to get to the point where it's instinctive. Just, but I love doing that. I don't know what it is. But there's a lot to this. So what I read is that, and they say this dates back to the Romans, that it was a sign when you were coming up to either a fellow officer or perhaps an officer from the other side. This is your way of saying, I'm disarmed, open hand. So I think, well, that makes sense. But I like this other interpretation better, namely that you're actually, if, the sun is coming in, you kind of hold, so it's actually a gesture of respect that the one before you is so full of life, of charisma, of light, in a kind of a glorious way that you're honoring that person full of light by sort of shading your eyes. So it's kind of that. So when you salute someone, you're acknowledging this light, and they salute you back and sort of acknowledge the light within you. And it seems to me that mutual exchange calls forth even more light. If I see the light in you, you feel it, right? It comes. So this mutual exchange has a way of, may I say, bringing more light into the world, which is the role of an illuminator. So a term maybe coined by David Brooks. His latest book is all about how you and I interact with one another, and how too often these days we're looking past one another. He says the illuminator is the person who comes into a room or turns to a particular person and actually sees them. And so think of what we have, you and I, as light. Call it attention, call it consciousness. We do have this capacity. I can do it right now. And you zero in on someone, right? And when you are the recipient of someone's attention, it kind of brings you up to the surface. And it's quite a remarkable gift that we have. And he says that illuminators have that awareness and lead with that. So they might come into a room and be open and be attentive and be gracious and be mindful of the quality of care that they are bringing to the person before them. And when you're the recipient of that kind of focus and care, it causes you to be lit up. It brings something to the surface in you. And so he says, and here's the quick example, captures it well. Interviewing people for the book. He was in a diner with a 93-year-old woman. I think in my mind, I think of her as a librarian, because he describes her as being kind of a stern disciplinarian, like, shh, that kind of a person. And he said so that's the exchange. He's sitting there and he's being himself a little formal, like, okay, we're taking notes here. And then boom, into the diner comes Pastor James. And you get this picture of Pastor James as kind of a big roly-poly loving guy. And he goes on to explain that probably Pastor James has this understanding that each and every one of his people And anyone he meets along the way is a child of God, full of infinite worth and dignity. And he sees that in people. So he's coming over. Her name is Mrs. Dorsey. And he comes into the diner and he goes, Mrs. Dorsey, you're wonderful. I love you. And in that moment, David Brooks sees this stern disciplinarian turn into a 9-year-old girl who's just suddenly like, hi, and she just lights up. And he says, I get it, that an illuminator has that power, that ability to light someone up and bring out their light, as opposed to a diminisher. And of course, no one wants to fall into that category. But a diminisher is just like the illuminator, but for whatever reason, chooses not to shine their light on a person who is in their vicinity. So if there is someone in the room, or you come in wherever it may be, and you decide for whatever reason not to acknowledge them, whether you know it or not, you have diminished them. You've made them, not always perhaps, I don't want to be categorical about this, but you can try it on for size, that if there is someone who comes into the room, even especially someone you might know, and there's no acknowledgement, it leaves you feeling unseen. It leaves you feeling smaller and diminished. And you might even feel after a while that there isn't really something in you that you could, it might even turn out your light. But I wouldn't want to go that far, but that's, I think, how this number one guy, I want to call him the one talent guy, gets into trouble. So a parable works when it makes you angry or you find it irksome, and this certainly is that, right? And I was referring earlier to a friend of mine who's been throughout his life a fiduciary, a kind of an investment, counselor, and he hates this because the poor guy who is the most prudent of them all, it's like, well, I've been entrusted with this worth, this value, this talent, and I'm going to be responsible, and I'm not going to mess up, and I'm not going to make a mistake. And so all of that concern that focuses this poor guy on not one, all of that concern backfires. And it seems unfair, right? Like here, shouldn't that be rewarded? And also, we could say that the fellow who had the 5, or even the 2, they had room to play with. If they lost a couple, no big deal. But he only had 1. He only had precious 1. And so it all feels a little unfair. And it was Einstein who said, all problems cannot be solved with the same thinking that created them. So if you get into this parable and start thinking about it a little too literally, it'll hold you and it'll drive you nuts. So the idea is that you get so frustrated with it that you just pull it back and you reframe it, and you hope to reframe it in a way that actually gives you a little grace, a little something to take home. And so it seems to me that if you add light instead of talent, money, it is a parable, right? It's not an allegory. So we have some license to say, okay, this is trying to tell us something, trying to give us some insight, but we need to kind of reframe it. And it seems to me reframing it in terms of light, that we're all come into this world, right? In the beginning, you hear the prologue of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and all things came to be through God. And that at some point early on it says, and the life that came into the world was the light of the world. And I think it takes very little suspension of belief to imagine that we're all in some way, call it our consciousness, and the ability we have through our eyes to shine our attention, that we are light, made of light. And that light is eternal, and you can't be snuffed out. And so this capacity we have to shine our light is really an amazing gift. And so he gets into trouble, and here's the grace. There is grace here. The grace is that, the story leaves, I think, part of the empathy that you feel for this poor guy. He knows the master's a harsh fellow. He's unethical. He steals. He harvests where he didn't sow seed. So this poor guy, and we get it, right, is so convinced that this guy is bad news, that what choice do I have but to hold on and protect this and then give it back to him, not lose it. So it's out of pure fear that he is unwilling to dare to let his light shine. He's afraid of making a mistake. But guess what the good news is? If you decide to enter into a room and overcome any shyness or insecurity and shine your light on someone and they don't notice or they don't acknowledge it, that's not a mistake. You can't go wrong by giving your light and your love and focusing it and being an illuminator. You can't make a mistake. So where's the fear? And furthermore, if you give it and it's not received, you still have it. Not even the meanest guy on the, not even the meanest master, not even God himself, herself, can keep you from shining your light. And there's no way you can lose it. And yet there is a downside to procrastinating. The other element of this, that a good parable is there's a clock ticking. And that's true. That is true. As much as I want to suspend that and say you got all the time in the world to kind of warm up to this idea of being an illuminator and shining your light on somebody else, but you don't. We've got a shelf life. We do. And in fact, this week, how many of you, it sounds getting like, Brad, don't go there, but Ben Staples was a sweet, sweet, sweet man. And he was gone in about 2 weeks, and I won't go into the details, but he was in his 70s. I was with friends this week. You don't need to be reminded, but I'll remind you anyways, but I was with friends this week and offering some thoughts, and I brought up to mind Marcia Rogers. I was in love with Marcia Rogers in the 6th grade. We kissed twice under the water. She was wonderful. And she was wonderful, and I got in touch with her later in life, and we connected, and she was the same sweet woman. She died at 55 of early onset Alzheimer's. And then Bill Plant, as another friend of mine, was diagnosed and gone in about a month or two, and his funeral was just yesterday. And so there is a clock ticking, and if that's not reason enough, and a parable kind of gives you that little adage, you don't want to be out there in outer darkness gnashing your teeth. As awful as I think that expression is, it does give us pause, right? And says, okay, maybe I'll just pay attention a little closer here. But the grace, which I emphasize, is we do have within us this light, and we can shine it. And when you shine it on anyone, chances are they're going to shine it back at you. And that exchange brings more light into this world. So that if we continue this, one day we will all become able, yay, in sort of an instinctive way to go, because we'll be looking at every one of us and there'll be this, and salute one another. I want to do that, so let's get on it.